There will come a time, and for some people it's coming now, and for others it'll be a little while, when you know you've got a date when you're going to move back home, and something you've been looking forward to for a long time. I think there's a couple of things to think about in making that transition. The first thing is that, as I mentioned, when you're in unfamiliar temporary accommodation and so on, maybe moving from one place to another, you're in this state of just slight arousal, slight tension, slight stressfulness, having to adjust to a whole lot of things that you know are only temporary. And when you're in that state, you can't do this kind of mulling, digesting, putting everything together and putting it in its perspective. That's such an important part of the feeling that I'm living my life. We get the feeling I'm living my life when we relax, when we sit in the sun for a while, go for a walk, have a nice dinner and talk about nonsense for a few hours with some friends. These things make us feel I'm here now. And as soon as the stress builds up, that sense drifts, loosens, gets lost. And so one of the things that happens when we actually get back to home, and of course there'll be stress moving back and finding places for everything, and if it's a new house, you know, moving, fixing things up. If it's an old house that's been repaired, you've got to adjust to a whole lot of things, find out everything that hasn't quite been done yet. But the important thing is, it's when you are back home that you can then relax in that way that I described, that we only do when we're at home and there are no demands and we're back in a routine. And it's absolutely predictable, and I've heard this from so many people in different disasters, that suddenly you find yourself, instead of just thinking, I'm glad that's over, you find yourself going back over what's happened, feeling low, feeling exhausted, feeling sad for what you've lost, possibly even starting to feel jumpy and frightened about things that trigger the memories of the trauma. And this is very understandable, because as long as you're in temporary accommodation or outside the environment where it happened, or you might still be there but you're living in a very temporary way in 3 rooms while the other rooms are being fixed up, and there's chainsaws going on all the time for months. Probably that's stopped now, but all of these things prevent this sense of I'm in my life. And so it's like you've got a whole bundle of experience. You've got the losses that are sitting there that you haven't had time to really think about because you're not in that environment, you're a temporary environment. You've got the trauma that you haven't got time to focus on. And you've got all these accumulated problems that have come about because of the temporary lifestyle you're leading. And so all of this experience has not been attended to. It's just simply shelved. I guess like, you know, you can have a very busy time in your life and you don't have time to put things away properly. I know it happens in my study. I come home after doing things, I just put stuff down and I've got to do something else or prepare and so on. And you get more and more stuff and it's all disorganised. And then you come to think, I best tidy all this up, but it's going to be such a huge job, I'll leave it till another time, and then something else happens and so on. And so what I accumulate is all of this unprocessed stuff, papers and so on. Well, I think it's exactly the same with our mind. That we have a huge amount of unprocessed experience, and that's going to come out when we move back, and I think it's really important to expect it. And it might come out as, now I feel the sadness for what I've lost. I haven't had time to think about it. I'm suddenly surprised. Some people who have lost everything in a fire have said, they find that at all sorts of odd moments they suddenly remember something they had. I remember way back in Ash Wednesday, somebody got the builder to rebuild exactly the same house they had, sort of beginning a week or two after the fires. And they moved in very quickly. But they had this curious sort of time warp situation where they would say, oh yes, that's in the cupboard. And they'd go to the cupboard and say, oh no, that was the previous cupboard. There's nothing in this cupboard. I haven't rebought it. So they hadn't taken in that they'd really lost it. They were just gone straight into the routines. So I think it's very important to let ourselves feel the discomfort, the pain of the loss, and maybe the enjoyment of the new things that we've acquired. And if we do that, we have a sense of being in time, in a process in our lives. And I think that's a very important thing to do, because one of the things that will tend to show up in the time afterwards when people start to relax is they will have what I call an identity problem. In psychology, we'd say my identity is the idea I have of myself. Like, we have an identity paper, a driver's license, got a picture of me and my address and so on, and that tells you who I am. Well, we have one of those in our mind. This is who I am. I'm this person who manages his life and is successful. But hang on a second, for a few years I haven't been managing and I haven't been very successful and I've had a lot of frustrations. Who am I now? Well, I think it's really important to have this opportunity to go back. Actually, people have had big experiences, but they are still the person they were. They're perhaps a bit sadder and a bit wiser and so on. But therefore, I think being aware of this need to go through the neglected period of life, all of the experiences that have been pushed aside while you've been too busy to pay attention. And that means if you can, when you move back in, try and allow plenty of time without many plans, without too highly organised activities, so you can just be. Just hang out there and see what happens, and then do things which help you feel comfortable. And there's a certain part of our being, mind, being, emotions, which really operate on symbols. That's part of what we lose. We lose symbols, don't we? As much as material things, because things always take on a meaning. We might have a picture that our great-grandmother gave us, and we remember that it was on the wall all through my childhood at her house, and I had my fond memories of her, and then when she died, I got it. And so this is a bit of my history there. And so that it has a very important meaning. But if that actually gets destroyed, do I lose that connection with the grandmother? No, but I've got to actually do something to actually transfer those experiences to something else. Maybe some other memento, or just be able to remember the pictures we've lost, or all the other objects we've lost, or the house we've lost. Now, the way we do that is by telling stories. It's so valuable, I think, for people to tell stories about what they've lost and what it meant to them. It's so interesting always to hear these little stories. And we don't have to have a big story, but then it reminds me of my picture I had from my great-grandmother, and so on. And tell them to each other in the family. Talk about, what do you miss? What do you remember? We can compare notes. This is where we are meeting with other people. We can talk about these things that are coming up. The fact that we actually put them in words means we do something. Instead of just having it as an emotional experience, I'm doing something. If I explain in words something that's just emotions, I do something with it. I'm not just a passive victim of those emotions. I'm doing something. And telling the story to other people who get it, that's a very important factor, isn't it? And often with people who've been through a disaster, they have these constant experiences that the people around them, who may be good friends and loving relatives, don't get it. They say really hurtful, well-intentioned but tactless things. So again, seeking out people who will understand, friends that might not have been quite so close before but have had a few hard times in their life, so they get it. They mightn't have been through a storm, but they've had something else happen. Or participate in community events. Just go along and see what happens. And that gives us a sense of identity. I'm part of this community that's been through this big experience together. And one way of doing that is to think about feeding those that need for symbols by engaging in, I'm going to call them rituals. A ritual is a set of actions and things we do, often with a bit of a public aspect to it, a bit of ceremonial. It doesn't have to be huge, but we just actually have a little ritual to mark something, to celebrate it. Think about how when a tragic event happens, how so many people who don't know the people involved, but they have some connection, it's their community, or maybe something's happened in their life, they come along and put flowers. And this little ritual, think of Lady Diana and so on, but there have been recent events, haven't there? Just that little ritual of laying of flowers, or toasting someone, or having a meal that is dedicated to, a welcome home meal or a housewarming. Now, these things that we then design, and maybe we'll invite a few people along and make it a little bit special and have a really nice meal. And this is actually creating a material basis for the feeling of the new start, or the completion of the renovations, or moving out of the impact zone. I think it's so helpful for these deeper layers of ourselves to mark them with some kind of ritualistic process. This actually means we have to think about how to do it, maybe talk with our other family members or neighbours, and design something. Again, makes us active for this level of connectedness and routines that in normal life we don't even think about. But now you need to rebuild it. And I would say, as you move in and settle down, try to actually think about the lifestyle and the routines you have, and think about being a little bit deliberate about designing your lifestyle so that it holds the values you want it to have, particularly if you've had to put them aside for quite some time. And when you think about that, you can shape that as you go along. We've sat for a long time with having our dinner on our knee because we didn't have anywhere watching the news to see what's going on next. But now we've got our nice dining room table, and we've got a little place to have a meal and a nice outlook, and so we'll shift to maybe doing it that way, whatever, just to give more of a sort of quality of life. So now, if we do that, you're actually creating nice experiences, and that helps enormously to put the grief into perspective. A loss is a loss, we can't take it away, but if we are creating a nice life in a new house or a renovated house, it goes a long way to softening the sadness and the anger and the frustration of what we had no say in losing. And so again, it means we become active shapers of our lives rather than just suffering the consequences of them. And it's often only when we're back in the situation where the trauma occurred that we're in a position to really start processing aspects of the trauma that we've put aside. And so I think it's so important to be aware that just as the grief will come up unexpectedly, in all sorts of little reminders, we'll suddenly find ourselves feeling sad, or maybe shedding a few tears. And in the same way, the trauma might be reactivated. We talk about the triggers, don't we? The wind blowing or any of those other features. So anything that suddenly evokes strong feelings of anxiety or anger or fear, even if you can't see the link, just say to yourself, is this a trauma re-experiencing? And what's the trigger? What has got me going? And it's so often the case that what gets you going is just a brief experience of something. And you didn't notice it at the time, but what you realise is an hour later you feel tense and headachy and irritable. And that's when you can stop and think, wait a second, what's going on? Ah, yes. I can remember that, and I'm sure there will be examples for storm experience, but I can remember being in Malakuta in the very early, sort of late autumn, early winter, 2 years after Black Summer. And people had realised, because we've been talking about triggers and so on, that as people started to light their fires for the cold weather, and there was a bit of smoke just drifting on still days, drifting around the town, people would smell that smoke and think, what's happening, and they'd actually start feeling tense. And they had to stop and think, wait a second, that's just warm fires in the winter, homeliness. It's not destructive. And they had to, and every time you do that, you're taking that symbol of smoke and you're pulling it out of the just being a trigger for trauma, and you're making it what it should be. It's all sorts of different sorts of smoke. A barbecue, a warm fire in the winter, keeping us warm, and so on. So this way I think there'll be a lot of things where the trauma will need to be reworked. Now, we don't need to talk about trauma all the time, but I think again it's very good to talk. Hey, that reminded me of the storm, or I felt a bit apprehensive when we had the sunset go down and there was a pattern of clouds. It reminded me of the clouds that day of the storm. Do you remember those? Yes. And then, why didn't we have a storm today? Look at the weather map. Try and work out how it's different. In that sense, you're bringing thinking and understanding in relation to emotions. Because if we don't bring thinking into emotions, emotions just go round around the same loops, and we just play the same record over and over again in our lives. No, we've got to think, and that's again where we can compare notes. So, help each other. Share your triggers. And I bet there'll be people who, when you say, oh, I heard a trigger of a certain sound, there was a sound of a branch falling out of a tree, and it gave me the heebie-jeebies. Oh yeah, that's right, somebody was cutting branches in their garden near my house, and I ended up having a big fight with my wife because I was feeling bad-tempered. I wonder if that was a trigger. Yes, that sort of thing. And it becomes very helpful for everyone to see that we're all caught in a process of going over these experiences and dealing with them in a new way that we've only just got the opportunity to because we are home. And if we do that, we create a very good foundation to create the new home as the foundation for a positive new future.